What's up, YouTube? Today I want to talk about why I upgraded from the Sony A6400 to the Sony A6700, and why you might want to do the same if you're still rocking an older mirrorless camera. We'll also talk about why upgrading might not make sense for you depending on what kind of videography or photography you're doing. Finally, we'll talk about whether another camera, such as the Sony FX30, might make more sense for you depending on what kind of videography or photography you're doing. Let's get into it. Let's talk a little bit about my history with cameras. I touched on this a little bit in one of my previous videos, but I actually learned to shoot photography on a film camera, which I've got right here. This is the Minolta X700 with a 50mm f1.7 lens. I won my first photography contest with using this camera, and it's still got a very special place in my heart. I also used a small point-and-shoot digital camera in those photo classes. While it didn't have an interchangeable lens, it did shoot in RAW. I don't have access to a lot of the images that I took back in those days, but I did start to develop my own personal editing style, including my preference for dark, moody images with a lot of contrast. Like I mentioned in one of my previous videos, I got my first mirrorless camera, a Sony Nex 3N, for my 19th birthday. I used that camera for about 8 years, and it got me through my college photography class and helped me get my headphone reviewing career off the ground. Now at this point, I was still almost exclusively shooting photography. I don't think the idea of shooting video seriously had entered my mind at all. The Sony Nex 3N's 16-megapixel camera was perfectly adequate for capturing the sort of everyday life and product photography that I was doing at the time. I never really felt limited by the camera. However, a couple of years ago, I decided to buy the Sony A6400 as an early birthday present to myself. All of the early videos here on YouTube that I have here on the channel, including all of my mechanical keyboard sound typing tests, were recorded on that camera. The Sony A6400 was and is a very capable camera. Its 24-megapixel sensor takes crisp, detailed images, and with the advent of modern AI-based denoising tools, is also pretty good in low light. I also think that if you're shooting 4K at 24 frames a second, off of a tripod with decent supplemental lighting, the Sony A6400 is just fine. If I hadn't started incorporating movement into my shots, I probably never would have upgraded. There are two big problems with the Sony A6400 when it comes to video, and they compound each other pretty severely. The first problem is that the Sony A6400 has really bad rolling shutter performance, which makes it impossible to do anything more than a very slow, deliberate pan without introducing warping into the image. The second problem is that the Sony A6400 lacks in-body image stabilization, or IBIS. I think it's fashionable here on filmmaking YouTube to downplay the importance of IBIS, and it is possible to mitigate some of the issues with microjitter through rigging. However, this requires a really maximalist approach to rigging, which isn't always practical. If I don't add as much weight as I possibly can to the Sony A6400, I end up with warped, jittery, unusable footage, guaranteed. This really became a problem when I took the A6400 on my honeymoon to Norway last December. I took some really great photos on that trip, but I also shot a decent amount of video. Unfortunately, even though I was shooting off of a gimbal, the amount of microjitter and rolling shutter issues in my footage caused me to have to toss basically all of the video that I shot on that trip, which was pretty frustrating. That disappointment caused me to have to upgrade again to the Sony A6700 earlier this year. This isn't going to be a full review of the Sony A6700, although I might do one of those at some point in the future. But I will say, for the kind of video that I originally saw myself shooting with it, it's been a tremendous camera. I had to travel to California shortly after getting the camera, and decided to take the opportunity to shoot a short travel vlog with it. Shooting with just a cage, an external monitor, and a top handle, I was able to get super smooth handheld footage without any micro jitters or rolling shutter artifacts. Also, even though I was shooting outdoors in the middle of the summer with an attached monitor over HDMI, I never had any issues with overheating, although I wasn't shooting for any more than a few minutes at a time with the camera. This brings me to my next point, which is that the Sony A6700, or any hybrid-style camera body really, is probably not the best choice for extended video shoots. This includes shooting talking head-style videos for YouTube where you're doing multiple takes over a long period of time. Now, I personally haven't had any issues using just the camera for extended periods, and even shooting with an external monitor over HDMI hasn't been any real problem. The problems start when you start adding other things on top. I've run into overheating issues very quickly when using Sony's camera app, in addition to using an external monitor over HDMI. It is possible to mitigate some of these overheating issues through camera rigging. I found that if I connected the camera to an external V-mount battery using a dummy battery to D-tap cable, I was able to record basically indefinitely in an indoor air-conditioned space. In my testing, I was able to record for about 5 hours before the battery died, and the camera never overheated or shut down. On the flip side, I strongly recommend against using USB-C power delivery with this camera, as doing so prompted an overheating warning to appear on the screen after just a few minutes of recording short clips. I also don't know how useful the camera's live streaming function is, as during a recent call, the camera overheated and shut down after maybe 10 or 15 minutes of continuous streaming. Maybe I should have turned the AC on, but this was still pretty disappointing. So what's my recommendation? Should you get a new camera if you're still rocking one from the 8-bit video era or earlier? The answer, as is the case for many things, is that it depends. I think if you're just doing photography, there's no real reason to upgrade to a newer camera. Sony's AI-based autofocus is very impressive, but I can't say that I ever recall wishing for better autofocus when I was still using the Sony A6400, or even the Nex 3N for that matter. I also don't think that 8-bit video is a significant limitation in and of itself, as long as you're shooting in a controlled studio environment with decent supplemental lighting. My mechanical keyboard sound tests were all recorded using fluorescent lighting with cheap diffuser umbrellas, and I still think they look pretty good. However, if you're moving yourself and your camera around during your shots, I do think investing in a camera body with decent rolling shutter performance and IBIS is the right move. I also think that if you're going to be shooting for extended periods, you should probably pick up a camera body with internal fans. What do you think, though? Is 10-bit video a must-have in 2024? Is IBIS overrated or underhyped? Let me know in the comments. If you've made it this far, please do me a favor by dropping a like and subscribing to the channel. I've got a bunch of new headphone reviews coming out soon, and I don't want you to miss them. Until next time, this is Bedrock Reviews, signing off.